Footsteps echoed across deck 8. A cabin door slammed. A mother's scream cut through the quiet halls as crew members sprinted toward the railing on the starboard side. In less than 10 minutes, the ship's security team was combing every corner of the vessel. In less than an hour, searchlights were sweeping the waves, and by sunrise all they found was a single scarf, drifting where a 15-year-old girl had vanished without a sound. 8 years later, another sprint began, this time down a resort walkway in the Bahamas. Eric Dalton dropped his briefcase, stumbled forward, and stared at the woman holding hands with 3 small children. The woman who looked like the daughter he buried years earlier. The woman who didn't freeze, or smile, or cry. She simply turned away. So what happened on that ship, and why did she choose a life without her parents? Before we move deeper into this case, let me know where you're watching from, subscribe, and tap the notification bell. Stories like this aren't just told, they're uncovered, and your support keeps these voices alive. Now let's go back to the moment the nightmare first set sail. March 9th, 2024. 4:17 p.m. The sun sat low over Nassau, washing the beachfront resort in a warm gold that made everything look softer than life really is. Tourists drifted between the pool and the bar, music hummed from hidden speakers, and the smell of sunscreen clung to the air. Eric Dalton pushed through the doors of a conference hall, tugging at his collar as if the room had been too small, too loud, too full of reminders that his life had moved on. Even if he hadn't. His keynote had gone well. People shook his hand. People admired him. None of them knew he carried a grief that never loosened its grip. They didn't know what the date meant. They didn't know who he'd lost 8 years ago. He stepped onto the patio, trying to breathe through the heaviness that always sat on his chest. He ordered a drink more out of routine than desire, took one sip, and turned toward the shoreline. That's when he froze. At first, it was only a silhouette. A young mother lifting a toddler into her arms, brushing a curl off the child's forehead, laughing at something the little one said. It was the kind of laugh Eric hadn't heard since 2016, the kind that used to fill his house on Saturday mornings. And then she turned. Just enough. Just for a second. Enough for the sunlight to catch the small birthmark beneath her left ear. The one he used to kiss when she was a baby. Jade's birthmark. The drink slipped from his hand and shattered on the tile. He didn't even feel it leave his fingers. His legs moved before his mind caught up, carrying him across the patio as if he were sleepwalking. She walked with a confidence she never had as a teenager, older now, more sure of herself. But Eric knew. A parent always knows. Every step closer made his breath shorter, his vision tighter, like the world was collapsing into this one impossible moment. Jade wasn't dead. Jade wasn't lost. She was here, alive, holding a child who had her eyes. And then he saw him. A man approached from behind her, sliding an arm around her waist like a habit he'd practiced for years. Eric's body reacted before his voice did. His stomach dropped, his knees weakened, and the air left his lungs. Trevor Mitchell. The man who'd once stood in his kitchen during the worst season of their marriage. The man Vanessa dated after one of their separations. A man who had no place near his daughter. A man who vanished from their lives right after Jade disappeared. A man who now stood beside her like he belonged there. Eric stumbled back, gripping the railing to steady himself as Jade gathered her 3 children. A boy around 6, another maybe 4, and a toddler who clung to her shoulder. They called her Mommy. They tugged on Trevor's shirt and called him Dad. And Jade, his Jade, didn't flinch, didn't look over her shoulder, didn't seem haunted by the life she'd left behind. She looked settled, like someone who had walked away from an ocean tragedy and never turned back. His hand shook violently as he lifted his phone. He zoomed in, snapped the picture. His throat tightened so hard it hurt. Jade? The word barely escaped him, cracked and fragile. She didn't turn, or maybe she did, and chose not to stop. She walked off toward the villas, sunlight catching the edges of the life she built without him. 3 children, a man he never trusted, and a peace he'd once prayed she'd find. But not like this. Never like this. Eric stood alone on the patio, the world muffled around him, staring down at the photo he'd just taken. Jade smiling, Trevor beside her. The children tangled around their legs, a family that shouldn't exist, a future built on the ashes of his. And for the first time in 8 years, he felt something he didn't recognize. Hope tangled with disbelief, love tangled with rage, 1,000 emotions he didn't have the language for. His voice broke into a whisper only he could hear. "That's my daughter." Before the moment in the Bahamas when Eric Dalton's world flipped, there was a different story unfolding, one that began long before anyone stepped onto a cruise ship. In the quiet Atlanta suburb where he lived, Eric carried two identities. In public, he was the polished entrepreneur. Steady handshake, organized presentations, a man clients found reliable. But at home, his marriage to Vanessa had faded into a tired routine of apologies that no longer held weight. The warmth they once shared had turned into polite tension, then open frustration, then long stretches of silence that felt heavier than any argument. By the end of 2014, the walls of their marriage finally gave out. The separation wasn't dramatic, it was weary. Vanessa packed boxes slowly, folding shirts with the kind of sadness that comes from years of trying. Jade watched quietly, clutching a sketchbook she'd carried since childhood. The apartment they moved into wasn't glamorous, but it had enough room for the two of them and the loneliness they both pretended not to feel. Eric stayed behind in the larger home, telling himself it was temporary, even though everything about the move felt final. Jade and Vanessa tried to build a new rhythm in that apartment, one weekday at a time. Jade went to school, came home, avoided asking her mother when they'd be a family again. Vanessa worked, cooked simple dinners, and tried to pretend she wasn't unraveling. And in the middle of that fragile adjustment, a man named Trevor Mitchell walked into their life. What began as a routine service call to fix a leaking sink became a slow, steady presence. Trevor wasn't flashy or overly charming. He had a gentle confidence, a sincere way of listening, and an almost old-fashioned respect in the way he spoke to Vanessa. When he visited again to redo the bathroom tiles, their conversations drifted beyond repairs and into the territory of real humans trying to rebuild themselves. He noticed how tired she was. He noticed how carefully she chose her words, as if afraid to burden anyone. Vanessa noticed how patient he seemed, how he paid attention in a way she hadn't experienced in years. What started as causal friendliness turned into something deeper. Trevor began showing up with takeout when Vanessa worked late. He offered to help Jade with a school project. He remembered their birthdays without needing reminders. Slowly, the apartment felt less like a holding place for broken hearts and more like a home being threaded together again. And Trevor didn't treat their relationship like a temporary arrangement. He loved Vanessa, deeply, sincerely, openly. He wasn't shy about it. He saw her as someone he wanted a future with, someone worth protecting. And because he loved Vanessa, he naturally embraced Jade. He didn't pretend to be her father. He didn't push himself into that space. But he gave her stability, attention, and gentle encouragement. She felt seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. For Jade, who'd spent years cushioning herself against her parents' emotional turbulence, Trevor felt safe. He stood in the audience at her art showcase. He cheered at her school award ceremony. He listened when she talked about her drawings. He noticed details her father used to miss. Small things, but important ones. The way Jade's shoulders relaxed around him told Vanessa everything she needed to know. This man mattered to her daughter. Their relationship didn't feel like a placeholder. It felt real. Trevor had fallen in love with Vanessa in earnest, and with time, he began to imagine a life with the two of them permanently. He talked about future vacations, about maybe getting a bigger place, about how the three of them could build something steady and lasting. And he meant every word. Meanwhile, Eric watched from afar. His weekends with Jade were quiet, filled with attempts to bridge a growing distance he didn't know how to close. He tried harder, cooked, bought her art supplies, showed up early for pickups, but something in Jade remained guarded. Not angry, just detached. And when she mentioned Trevor casually, without resentment or hesitation, Eric felt the sting of replacement sharper than he expected. But guilt has a way of forcing clarity. In that year apart, Eric finally faced the damage he'd done, the absence, the defensiveness, the half-efforts disguised as trying. Therapy wasn't a checkbox anymore, it was a mirror. He saw the husband he'd been. He saw the father he could have been. And for the first time, he understood that Vanessa hadn't walked away from him. She'd walk toward something she could survive. Early January 2016, humbled and changed, he knocked on Vanessa's apartment door. He didn't come with excuses, promises, or grand gestures. He came with truth. He told her what he'd realized in counseling. He told her he wanted to rebuild their family. Not halfway, not temporarily, but fully. Vanessa didn't melt. She listened carefully. And beneath her walls, there was still love. Thin, bruised, but alive. She wanted her family back. She wanted Jade to have her father. She wanted to believe in second chances. Breaking up with Trevor was the part she dreaded most. When she told him, Trevor's face didn't twist in anger or bitterness. It crumpled. He loved Vanessa deeply, and he loved the life he'd been building with her and Jade. To him, they weren't just people he dated. They were the family he believed was becoming his own. Losing them felt like having a future ripped away. But Vanessa was firm. She chose her marriage. She chose her daughter's father. She chose the history she'd built with Eric, even if it was messy. Within weeks, she and Jade moved back into their old home. Eric tried to make every day feel safe and steady. Vanessa tried to believe in their fresh start. Jade tried to understand why the ground kept shifting under her feet. And as Eric planned a family cruise out of Miami, a hopeful, symbolic reunion, he had no idea that Trevor's heartbreak had quietly hardened into something else. Something that would follow them far beyond Atlanta. Eric didn't know Trevor had already begun sliding back into Jade's life. Quietly, secretly, and with the kind of determination that only comes from a love that refuses to let go. Before the cruise ship ever left the port in Miami, Jade Dalton was already drifting. At 15, she carried an emotional weight she could not name, shaped by years of watching her family fall apart and piece itself back together, only to fall again. She loved both her parents, but she had learned early that love didn't always translate into safety. Some nights they laughed around the dinner table. Other nights, the air felt sharp enough to cut through. Growing up in a home where affection and tension traded places so often, Jade began to wonder if the best parts of life always came with a warning attached. When her parents separated, she folded that pain into herself. And when they reunited, she didn't fully unfold it. She had spent so long trying to hold the emotional balance between them that even peace felt temporary. At school, she looked like every other teenager moving through crowded hallways, earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder. But inside, she carried the constant fear that life could change in a single conversation. She longed for someone who didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't leave, someone who saw her without assuming she'd bounce back from everything. That's the crack Trevor Mitchell slid into. When Vanessa ended their relationship to reunite with Eric, Trevor played the role of the understanding adult. He told Vanessa he respected her decision. He told her he wished her well. He told her he wanted Jade to be okay, and on the surface he accepted that chapter closing. But privately, he didn't retreat. He shifted gears. His focus landed squarely on Jade, the one person whose attachment to him was still tender, unshielded, and deeply unmet by the adults around her. His first messages were harmless enough. A quick check-in during the school lunch hour. "I hope your day is going well" text after she mentioned having a test. Nothing a girl would be ashamed to show her mother, and nothing a father would flag as concerning. But Trevor understood something most adults overlooked. Consistency can feel like love to a child who grew up in emotional chaos. He knew that if he stayed present quietly, Jade would lean toward him naturally. The messages grew more personal, but always disguised as concern. He told her she was smart. He told her she handled things better than most adults. He told her she had a good head on her shoulders. Compliments she didn't hear enough from the people who mattered most. And after a while, Jade began responding with pieces of her fear. The fear that her parents' sudden reconciliation wouldn't last. The fear that she'd be hurt again. The fear that she'd go back to living between two homes and pretending everything was fine. Trevor didn't shut those fears down. He fed them. Softly, carefully, with the tone of someone who wanted the best for her. He told her she wasn't imagining things. He told her that he, too, had worried her parents weren't meant for each other. He told her she deserved a life where adults didn't change their minds like weather patterns. And she believed him because she wanted to. In the Dalton household, the reunion brought its own tension. The The smiles were stiff, the dinners felt rehearsed. Therapy sessions were filled with cautious optimism that never felt steady. Eric tried to rebuild his place in Jade's life, but the emotional distance she'd developed was not something he could bridge in a few weeks of trying harder. Vanessa tried to smooth out the awkward edges, but Jade sensed the fragility of the new peace immediately. Every time her parents exchanged a hesitant look, Jade's stomach tightened. Every time they paused mid-sentence, she wondered if a fight was brewing. And at the end of each uneasy day, when the lights were off and the house was quiet, there was always a message from Trevor waiting. "Are you okay? You seemed a little down today. You don't have to pretend around me." For a girl who had spent years pretending, those words felt like relief. As the departure date for the cruise approached, Jade felt split down the middle. On one side was her family, the original version of home she still wanted to believe in, the mother who loved her deeply, and the father who was finally trying to hold them together. On the other side was Trevor, whose voice felt steady, warm, and understanding in a world full of emotional landmines. She didn't see him as a threat. She saw him as someone who chose her, someone who wanted her, someone who hadn't disappointed her yet. The night before the cruise, Jade confessed her fear to him. "What if they fall apart again? I can't go through that another time." Trevor typed slower this time, choosing each word like a pin placed carefully into soft ground. "You're right to be scared. People don't change just because they say they will. You deserve a home that won't fall apart on you. You can build your own future, Jade. You don't have to repeat their cycle." He never directly told her to leave with him. He didn't have to. He planted an idea that would sit in her chest during every awkward dinner, every forced smile, every moment her parents tried too hard or not hard enough. By the time the Carnival ship left Miami, Jade wasn't running toward Trevor, but she wasn't running away from him either. She was simply moving in the direction of the only person who made her feel chosen. What Jade didn't understand was that the seed Trevor planted wasn't just an idea, it was a path, and she was already walking it. Before we move into the next chapter, tell me something honest in the comments. Do you think a child this emotionally vulnerable ever truly stands a chance against an adult who knows exactly how to fill their void? Make sure you subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring cases like this into the light and give victims the voice they were denied. The Carnival cruise was meant to be the Great Reset, the moment the Dalton family stepped out of old patterns and into something new. Eric booked it with the same hope people bring to fresh starts, believing that an ocean between them and their problems might loosen everything that had tightened over the years. Miami's harbor buzzed with vacationers who carried excitement on their faces. The Daltons carried something heavier, the responsibility of trying again, not just to be a family, but to feel like one. The first hours on board looked promising. Jade posed for a picture reluctantly, her smile soft and uncertain. Vanessa slipped her arm through Eric's with a kind of practiced hopefulness. They stood on the deck together, watching Miami shrink behind them, the skyline fading into pink clouds as the ship pushed toward open water. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Jade leaned against the rail, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face, and for a brief moment it looked like the heaviness she carried had lifted. But inside she felt like a traveler stepping into a story she didn't completely believe in. Dinner on the first night was awkward, in the way that families recovering from emotional wounds often are. Eric cracked a few jokes, ones he used to rely on back when Jade was 8 and everything felt simpler. Vanessa smiled politely. Jade picked at her food, nodded at the right moments, and listened more than she spoke. When they returned to the cabin later, Vanessa whispered to Eric that maybe things were going well. Eric nodded, even though he felt the fragile tension that hung beneath Jade's quietness. The next morning brought sun, pancakes, and a burst of forced enthusiasm. They walked the ship together, toured the pool area, browsed souvenir shops, and tried to pretend none of this effort felt unnatural. Other families laughed loudly at their tables, leaning into each other with comfort that came easily. The Daltons moved like 3 people attempting a dance they hadn't practiced in years, every step slightly out of sync, By the afternoon, Jade's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked it when her parents weren't looking, her heart jumping every time the screen lit up. Trevor's messages had been steady since the night before they left port. Short check-ins, small questions, words she could read quickly without drawing suspicion. She knew she shouldn't be responding, but ignoring him felt impossible. He was the only person who didn't talk to her like she was fragile. He made her feel chosen in a world where she often felt like a supporting character in her own life. During a sunset walk across the upper deck, Jade drifted behind her parents. Her phone held low. "You okay?" Trevor wrote. "Fine," she answered. "You don't sound fine." She hesitated, then typed, "It's weird here. They're acting like everything's perfect." "I told you they would," he replied. "They always pretend until they fall apart again." Those words settled deep inside her, too deep for a 15-year-old heart. That night she skipped dinner, claiming exhaustion. Vanessa knocked softly at her cabin door, offering to bring food, but Jade insisted she just needed a nap. When her parents left, she sat in the dark, scrolling through Trevor's older messages, replaying every reassurance he'd ever given her. On the other side of the ship's wall, Eric and Vanessa sat across from each other at a table for three, trying to pretend the empty chair between them didn't say something louder than either of them wanted to admit. The next day didn't go much better. Jade wandered the teen club alone, ate a quick lunch by herself, and spent long stretches standing at the railing, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. Headphones in. Thoughts racing. Trevor's words echoing. She wasn't angry at her parents. She was afraid that the small cracks she sensed were early warnings of another collapse. Afraid that the peace she saw was only temporary. Afraid to hope. By February 13th, the ship felt less like a vacation and more like a fragile stage where everyone acted out a version of closeness they hadn't earned yet. Eric noticed how distant she'd become. He tried to pull her into conversations, tried to make her laugh the way she used to, but every attempt felt like reaching through fog. Vanessa watched Jade carefully, noticing the subtle way her daughter's shoulders tensed when Eric asked questions, or the way Jade stared off into space after responding to texts she pretended not to get. As night fell, the mood on the ship was festive. Music playing, drinks clinking, families laughing against the backdrop of moonlit waves. Jade stood alone on the deck again, her phone glowing in her hands. She typed out a message she didn't fully understand. "I don't know if I can do this." Trevor responded instantly, as if he'd been waiting for that moment. "You don't have to," he wrote, "not anymore." Her breath trembled. "What does that mean?" she typed. His response arrived as a single sentence, one that cracked open the last bit of resistance she'd been holding on to. The night Jade Dalton disappeared unfolded in near silence, a calm so still it hid the truth pressing beneath it. While the ship rocked gently over dark water, the Daltons slept deeper than they had in months. For once, the tension that usually kept Vanessa tossing and Eric staring at the ceiling seemed to dissolve. Exhausted from days of emotional effort, both parents drifted into a sleep heavy enough to quiet the instincts that might have warned them something was wrong. But Jade had been awake for hours. Long before dawn touched the horizon, she lay curled beneath her blanket, phone glowing softly beneath her fingers. Trevor's messages came in a steady stream, carefully written, perfectly timed, each one nudging her closer to the decision he had been shaping inside her for weeks. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't rush. He simply fed the deepest ache she had, the desire for a stable home that didn't collapse without warning. His words landed with surgical precision. "You deserve a life where you're not fixing everyone else's mistakes. You can't stay here forever, Jade. They're too unstable. I can give you the future they can't." Then came the message that flipped her world completely. "I'm already on the ship." She sat upright, pulse thudding in her ears. She read it again, then again. It didn't scare her. It validated everything she'd been feeling. Someone had come for her. Someone had chosen her without hesitation. The next message arrived slowly, like he wanted each word to settle in her chest before the next one came. "I've made arrangements. A crew member I trust is helping us. When the ship stops, we walk off together. A new country, new names, a life without all this chaos, just you and me." To Jade, it didn't sound like running away. It sounded like leaving a life that had worn her out long before her 15th birthday. She believed she was stepping into a future built on stability, something she'd never truly known. Trevor framed it as freedom, protection, love, and she clung to it because the alternative felt like an endless loop of disappointment. With the ship quiet and her parents finally resting, she slipped out of bed. She moved through the dark cabin by memory, dressing in silence. Leggings, a light sweater, and the pink scarf she always wore. For a moment she paused at the foot of her parents' bed. Vanessa's breathing was steady. Eric's shoulders rose and fell in slow, even movements. They looked peaceful in a way they rarely were when they were awake. Jade whispered, "I'm sorry," so quietly she wasn't sure she'd actually said it. Then she left. Outside the cabin, the hallway stretched dim and empty. The floor vibrated faintly with the heartbeat of the ship. She walked with careful purpose, checking her phone with each turn. Trevor guided her step by step, telling her which hallways to take, which service door would be open, which stairwell would lead her to the crew member waiting to help. She followed the plan as if following a map to a new home. Somewhere deep in the ship's belly, a crew door creaked open. A man in uniform, expression flat, eyes avoiding hers, stepped aside. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Jade believed he was part of something good. She slipped past him into a narrow service corridor and began the escape Trevor described. While she walked deeper into the staff-only areas, her parents slept undisturbed, unaware that their daughter was no longer anywhere on the ship. The next morning, sunlight poured into the cabin. The room was humid, warm, unusually bright. Vanessa stretched first, blinking at the clock. It was well past noon. They had slept through breakfast, through morning announcements, through everything. She nudged Eric awake, groaning playfully about how exhausted she felt. The cabin still felt peaceful. Nothing seemed out of place. It wasn't until Vanessa walked toward the bathroom that she noticed Jade's bed perfectly made, too neatly, unnaturally neat. The blanket was smooth, untouched. The pillow was undented. Her shoes were gone. Her scarf wasn't on the chair. A cold shock ripped through Vanessa's body. "Eric," she whispered. Then louder, panic breaking through. "Eric, she's not here." What followed was chaos. The frantic search of every corner of the cabin, then the hallway, then the nearest decks. After nearly an hour of desperate looking, they alerted security. Crew members spread out across the ship, checking lounges, stairwells, and dining areas. But Jade wasn't in any of them. Not that morning. Not that afternoon. Later, a housekeeper found her pink scarf near the Deck 9 railing, caught gently between two metal slats, untouched by water, undamaged. The discovery tilted the investigation toward the most obvious explanation, a fall during the night. Authorities reviewed what little they could piece together and concluded she must have gone overboard while her parents slept. There were no witnesses, no splash reported, no alarms triggered, no signs of struggle. And without evidence contradicting the theory, the case was labeled a tragic accident. The ship docked days later. The Daltons left without answers. Their home became a graveyard of memories, her art supplies, her clothes, her unfinished sketchbook. Eric drowned in every moment he replayed. Vanessa dissolved in guilt and silence. Their marriage, already fragile, broke under the pressure of grief no parent should bear. For 8 years, they believed the ocean took their daughter. In the weeks that followed Jade's disappearance, the Dalton household shifted into a kind of suspended reality, a place where time moved forward, but the people inside it stayed frozen. Eric and Vanessa returned to Atlanta with luggage that felt heavier than when they left, not because of anything inside it, but because of everything missing. The house was too quiet, too neat, too painfully intact for a family that no longer existed the way it had 10 days earlier. Eric tried to return to work almost immediately, telling colleagues he needed routine to stay sane. But the office became a maze of reminders. Empty chairs in conference rooms, fathers picking up their daughters after school, the polite, "How are you holding up?" questions he wasn't equipped to answer. His assistant once found him standing in his office long after business hours, staring at a framed photo of Jade at age 9, smiling with her missing front tooth. He didn't hear her enter. His grief was consuming enough to mute the world around him. He buried himself in spreadsheets, proposals, business trips, anything that kept him from going home too early. Success became a distraction disguised as progress. But grief doesn't leave when you stay busy. It follows. It sits in the back seat of the car. It lingers in hotel rooms. It crawls into the spaces between conversations. For Eric, it became a shadow that never stopped speaking the same question. Why didn't I wake up? Meanwhile, Vanessa unraveled in a completely different way. The woman who once held her family together with sheer determination now struggled to hold herself upright. She attended therapy sessions religiously for months, then began missing them because she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. Days blended into nights, nights blurred into mornings she didn't remember. Friends brought food she didn't eat. Relatives called, but she rarely answered. Her reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped, voice too soft to carry her sadness. She blamed herself for every detail of that cruise. She blamed herself for the separation years earlier, for choosing Trevor, for leaving him, for dragging Jade back into a house with unresolved fractures. She replayed the moments she dismissed Jade's subtle discomfort, the nights she assumed everything was fine because Jade didn't speak up, the mornings she believed their family was healing. Guilt became her constant companion, wrapping around her like a second skin. The police? They moved on. Without evidence of foul play, without a body, without a witness, the investigation hit a wall so quickly it almost felt careless. Officers told the Daltons the same rehearsed line. Sometimes the ocean keeps its secrets. The case file grew thinner with time, not thicker. Reports slowed, then stopped. No new emails, no new calls, no new leads. They had labeled Jade's disappearance an accident, and their job was done. Eric refused to accept that. He hired private investigators, one after another, each promising expertise, each failing to deliver anything meaningful. The first investigator tracked cruise crew manifests, the second traveled to Florida ports, the third followed a lead to Mexico that evaporated within weeks. By the fourth investigator, Eric had already spent more than $40,000. By the sixth, the total exceeded $70,000. He didn't care. Money meant nothing next to the possibility of a single shred of truth. But every lead collapsed. Every trail went cold. Every hint of hope dissolved before it could even take shape. The investigators eventually told him what he feared most. There's nothing left to chase. But Eric kept trying long after people stopped telling him to. He searched online forums at 2 a.m. He cold-called advocacy groups, cruise specialists, missing persons consultants, anyone who might offer a new angle. In his mind, stopping the search felt like accepting her death. And he couldn't do that. Back in the Daltons' home, Jade's room became a museum of who she had been. Vanessa couldn't bring herself to move anything. The drawings pinned to the walls remained untouched. Her brushes stayed in jars. Her shoes were lined up neatly beside her closet as if she might walk in from school any moment. Sometimes Eric stood in the doorway and whispered, "I'm still looking," as if she could hear him through time. 8 years passed that way. Birthdays came and went, with a single candle burning in silence. Christmas mornings remained unopened until afternoon. Mother's Day and Father's Day felt like unwanted reminders of everything they had lost. Eric and Vanessa, once reuniting with hope, drifted into a kind of emotional exile. They spoke only to exchange updates about dead-end leads or to confirm therapy appointments. Their grief didn't just break their marriage, it hollowed it out until nothing remained. Yet the most painful part was this. The truth had been sitting inside Jade's phone the entire time. The device, retrieved hours before the ship docked, had been turned over to authorities. But no one performed a deep extraction. No one recovered deleted messages. No one checked hidden folders or third-party apps. A surface-level review told investigators nothing, so they stopped looking. The digital trail that could have changed everything lay buried in that phone like a locked diary no one bothered to pick up. Inside it were the fragments of Trevor's manipulation, the emotional grooming, the promises, the escape plan. Evidence that Jade wasn't running away from life. She was running toward something she thought was safer. If anyone had looked closely, the truth would have surfaced. But no one did. And so for 8 long years, the Daltons carried the weight of an ocean that never held their daughter. Before we continue, I want to ask you something deeply personal. Do you believe grief ever truly fades, or does it just learn how to live inside us? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Your support helps us tell stories that would otherwise stay buried in silence. 8 years is a long time to live inside a wound. For Eric Dalton, grief didn't fade, it hardened. It reshaped him into a quieter version of the man he once was. The Eric who used to fill rooms with certainty had become a man who measured his words, who paused before answering, who lived with the constant pressure of unspoken guilt pressing against his ribcage. Therapy gave him a language for pain, but not a cure. There is no cure for losing a child without ever holding her one last time. There is no relief in burying something you cannot see. Closure requires finality, and Eric never got that. Only theories, only paperwork. Only condolences from people who meant well but didn't understand that hope, grief, and anger can coexist inside the same body for years. He kept living because life had to be lived, but everything he did was half-shadowed by the absence of a daughter who should have been turning 23. Whenever he visited the small memorial stone he'd placed beneath the magnolia tree at the edge of the cemetery, Jade's favorite flower, he'd run his fingers along her engraved name and whisper things he wished she'd heard. You mattered. I'm sorry. I'm still your dad. Vanessa grieved differently. She cried more openly, collapsed more frequently, and blamed herself more viciously. She and Eric rarely spoke unless it involved an anniversary or a bill concerning the memorial plot. Their marriage had fractured long before Jade vanished, but losing her ended any chance of repair. They no longer fought. They didn't have the energy. Their anger had burned itself out, leaving behind two people who shared a wound, but lived in separate houses, separate lives, separate silences. Eric tried dating once. A coworker set him up with a friend who smiled gently and asked careful questions about his hobbies, his work, his life. She was warm, patient, understanding, and he realized halfway through dinner that he had nothing left to give anyone. He ended the night early and never tried again. Instead, he poured his time into work, not because he loved it, but because it was easier than feeling. By 2024, Eric had become a man of routine. Wake up, go to work, call Vanessa on birthdays, send flowers on anniversaries of the disappearance, visit the magnolia tree when the guilt got too loud, sleep, repeat. When the company asked him to represent their division at a real estate summit in the Bahamas, he agreed without hesitation. Travel had become another numbing agent. Hotel rooms with no memories, airports full of strangers, hours where no one expected him to talk about Jade. He packed his bags the same way he'd packed them 100 times before. Quietly, methodically, without thinking too hard about anything. He didn't fly to the Bahamas looking for answers. He certainly didn't expect hope. Hope was something he had buried with the memorial stone years earlier. The morning of the conference, Eric arrived at the beachfront resort half distracted, scrolling through notes on his phone as he walked. The sun was already heating the pavement, and sweat gathered at his collar as he stepped into the main conference hall. He gave his presentation, shook hands, listened to corporate chatter about investments and market shifts, topics that felt meaningless compared to the life he'd lived off stage. By 2:40 p.m., he stepped outside for air, loosening his tie and scanning the patio for a quiet corner. He wasn't looking for anything except a chair in the shade. But grief has a cruel way of stalking you. It waits for the moment you're least prepared. He saw her in motion first. A young woman carrying a toddler on her hip, sunlight catching the curls falling over her shoulder. She lifted the child as he laughed, and when she turned slightly, Eric felt the air vanish from his lungs. The profile, sharper now, older but undeniably familiar, hit him like a physical blow. His heart lurched, stuttered, then raced. His feet moved before his brain caught up. He stepped closer, afraid to blink, terrified that the image would vanish like a mirage. The woman shifted her hair, and that was when he saw it, the small, crescent-shaped birthmark under her left ear. The birthmark Jade had hated as a teenager. The birthmark he had kissed goodnight for 15 years. His knees weakened, and a sound escaped him, half gasp, half prayer. He clutched the railing for balance. His mind tried to reject what his eyes insisted was real. 8 years of grief collided with the impossible truth unfolding in front of him. But the world didn't stop. The woman, his daughter, or a ghost wearing her face, kept walking. And then a man approached from behind her, touching her lower back with familiarity. Eric knew that face too. The jawline, the easy posture, the confident smile. Trevor Mitchell. The man Vanessa once loved. The man Jade once admired. The man Eric blamed for everything that had gone wrong long before the cruise. Trevor leaned in and kissed her temple. The children called him Daddy. Eric felt the ground tilt. His breath turned shallow. His trembling hands fumbled for his phone. The world blurred into a haze of disbelief and adrenaline as he watched the family he thought had died build sandcastles beside the water. Trevor leaned in and kissed her temple. The children called him Daddy. Eric felt the ground tilt beneath him. His breath turned shallow. His trembling hands fumbled for his phone as he stepped behind a column, watching from a distance. The world blurred into a haze of disbelief and adrenaline as he stared at the family he thought had died, alive, laughing, whole. Jade never once looked in his direction. She didn't pause, didn't scan the patio, didn't sense the storm gathering just feet away. She simply gathered her children, adjusted the toddler on her hip, and strolled toward the beach without a hint of hesitation. To her, the afternoon was ordinary. To Eric, it was the moment the universe fractured open. Eric Dalton didn't remember leaving the resort patio. One second he was staring at a woman he had grieved for 8 years, and the next he was stumbling through the winding paths of the property, gripping his phone as if it might dissolve in his hand. His heart hammered in a frantic, uneven rhythm, shock, denial, rage, hope, terror, every emotion firing at once, each one contradicting the last. He walked past a bar, past a group of tourists laughing over cocktails, past families soaking in the sun. For Eric, the world had collapsed into a single blurry thought. Jade is alive. Alive. And standing beside the man who had once been inside his home, inside his marriage, inside his daughter's life. By the time he reached his hotel room, his legs were shaking so violently he had to brace himself against the dresser. He set his phone down, stared at the photo he'd taken, zoomed in, shaky but clear enough to erase every doubt, and his entire body revolted. He ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left but dry heaving and the faint taste of salt and panic. The truth felt corrosive, eating at his insides with every breath. Jade wasn't dead. Trevor hadn't vanished. They had escaped together. And not just escaped, they had built a life, a family, a future. While he and Vanessa cried themselves numb. He splashed cold water on his face and stared into the mirror. He didn't recognize the reflection. His eyes were wild, rimmed with red. His skin looked gray, his jaw locked tight enough to crack. This wasn't the composed businessman who spoke at conferences. This was a father on the edge of something dangerous. But even through the panic, he knew he couldn't stay frozen. He needed answers, proof, explanation, anything that made the impossible feel real. So he went back. Late that afternoon, he changed into clothes that helped him blend into the crowd. Simple shirt, sunglasses, a hat pulled low. He returned to the resort and waited in the shadows near the walkway that led to the pool. He watched families come and go, watched couples stroll toward the beach, watched children chase each other with plastic buckets, and then he saw them. The woman, Jade, now calling herself Tiffany Monroe, walked with the practiced ease of someone who had repeated this routine for years. Her toddler rested lazily on her hip, a small hand tangled in her mother's shirt. The older two children chased each other across the patio, while Trevor, now presenting himself as Ryan Monroe, carried a bag filled with towels and snacks. Eric stayed behind a row of tropical plants, careful, deliberate, terrified that a single wrong step would blow his chance to understand what he'd just stumbled into. He memorized every detail, how Jade's hair fell against her back, how she gently fixed her daughter's sun hat, how Trevor touched her waist as if they shared a secret life built far away from the grave Eric visited every year. It was the casualness that hurt the most. They looked like a family. They looked happy. They looked whole. And he was the ghost. He followed them at a distance, never close enough to be seen, always close enough to study the life they'd built. He watched them visit the beachfront shops, listened to Jade laugh, a sound he hadn't heard since she was 15. He watched Trevor hand the toddler a cup of juice and kiss the top of her head with paternal familiarity. Every second ripped something new inside him. When they finally left the resort, Eric followed their path from the shadows. They walked to a small parking area, loaded bags into a rental SUV, buckled the children into car seats, and drove away, turning onto a coastal road that disappeared behind a line of palm trees. Eric let them get a long head start before he flagged down a taxi. He didn't trust his voice, so he simply showed the driver the photo on his phone and pointed in the direction the SUV had gone. 20 minutes later, they pulled onto a quiet road lined with beachfront villas. Modest, private, far away from the tourist noise. The taxi rolled past one villa before Eric whispered for the driver to stop. The SUV was parked under a cluster of palms. A pair of towels hung over the porch railing. A pair of children's sandals rested by the door. This was their home, their life, their world without him. He told the taxi driver he didn't need the return ride. He stood alone on the sandy roadside long after the engine faded into the distance. Every step he took toward that villa felt like walking deeper into the aftermath of a nightmare he hadn't realized he'd been living. Inside that house were 8 years of stolen answers. 8 years of unspoken explanations. 8 years of betrayal wrapped in the face of the daughter he would have died to protect. Eric turned away only when the sun began to fall. He walked back toward town slowly, deliberately, every breath, sharpening a decision he wasn't ready to acknowledge. That night in his hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat, he didn't cry, he just sat in silence as something inside him hardened into certainty. In the morning, when the gun store opened, he was the first customer of the day. The clerk asked if he needed help choosing. Eric shook his head. He already knew what he wanted. The purchase was legal, fast, paperwork signed, gun boxed, bag in hand. He walked out of the shop heavier than he'd ever felt before. Long before Eric Dalton stood outside that villa with a gun in his hand, the truth had been writing itself in shadows. The real story did not begin in the Bahamas. It did not begin on that patio. It began years earlier, quietly, invisibly, inside the private messages of a frightened 15-year-old girl and a grown man who understood exactly how to bend her world toward his own. Trevor Mitchell had never stopped grooming Jade. Even during Vanessa's relationship with him, long before the breakup, long before the Dalton family tried to rebuild, he had been planting seeds. Compliments disguised as support, concern disguised as affection, advice disguised as control. He framed her as mature, special, misunderstood. He made her believe her emotional exhaustion wasn't a symptom of her parents' instability, but a sign that she wasn't meant for a normal teenage life. And Jade, fragile and hungry for stability, listened. By the time the cruise happened, Trevor had constructed an emotional cage so tight that she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and his began. In deleted messages, fragments only later recovered, he painted himself as her protector from the world that had failed her. He told her she deserved more than a household built on broken promises. He said the Daltons would never stop hurting each other, and hurting her. Most destructive of all, he convinced her that leaving with him wasn't betrayal. It was survival. When he followed them onto the ship, it wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. He bribed a staff member with cash and a promise of more, securing access to a restricted dock used only for crew transitions and supply offloading. He instructed Jade to meet him at the service hall at dawn. She slipped into a stolen staff uniform that hid her identity just long enough to fool anyone who glanced her way. She stepped off that ship believing she was choosing a stable life, believing Trevor was saving her, believing her parents' world was collapsing and she was escaping the rubble. From Miami, they drove north to a contact Trevor trusted, then boarded a small charter plane to the Cayman Islands. Weeks later, they moved again, Belize, then a short stint in Honduras, before finally settling in the Bahamas under new names and falsified paperwork. Jade became Tiffany Monroe. Trevor became Ryan, and every year layered a new identity over the old one until Jade barely recognized the girl she used to be. Her journals, found much later, painted the truth through shaking handwriting and tear-stained pages. I kept waiting for a moment to turn back. I thought he loved me. I thought he was saving me. I didn't know how to face them again. After a while, I wasn't sure if I was hiding or trapped. She loved the children she bore. But she feared the man raising them, and she feared the world she left behind even more. That was the past. The present was a man standing outside a villa with a weapon in his hand and a lifetime of unanswered questions crammed into his chest. Eric approached the door slowly, each step weighted with something he couldn't name. Rage, hope, horror. None of it fit neatly into words. When he finally knocked, his hand trembled so badly the wood rattled. The door opened sooner than he expected. Jade froze. Her breath hitched, her face drained of color. She looked at him like she was staring at a ghost, except he was the one who had buried her. The toddler on her hip squirmed, confused by the sudden tension. Jade whispered his name like it hurt to say it. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought you'd hate me." Eric stepped inside because his legs moved on instinct, not thought. He reached for her but stopped halfway, unsure if he had the right. The smell of baby powder and dinner still lingering in the air clashed violently with the war zone building in his chest. Then Trevor appeared. He walked into the room with the same false confidence he always carried, like a man who believed he could outtalk consequences. He put himself between Jade and Eric, puffing up as if his presence alone could rewrite the narrative. He spoke first. "You need to leave. Right now." Eric didn't move. Trevor, emboldened, kept talking. He said Jade made her own choices. He said Eric was unstable. He said everything that had happened was none of his business. And then he uttered the word no grieving father should ever hear, not after 8 years of torment. Crazy. The room snapped. Eric's breath hitched. Something detonated inside him, a violent, guttural break between grief and fury. His hand moved before his mind caught up. Trevor lunged for the door. Trying to flee or tackle or block, no one would ever agree on which. The gunshot echoed through the villa like it tore the air in half. Trevor collapsed, clutching his chest. Blood spread across the floor, dark and fast. His gasps were shallow, desperate, fading by the second. In the hallway, the children screamed, not understanding the scene, only the terror in their mother's voice. Jade fell to her knees beside her father, sobbing uncontrollably, her apologies spilling into the room like broken glass. "I didn't know how to come back. I was scared. I was so scared." Eric didn't speak. He stared at Trevor's body with an expression carved from 8 years of unanswered grief. And then, faint at first, growing louder. Sirens, echoing through the distance, approaching fast. "Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you believe betrayal is ever truly forgivable? Or does some damage stay permanent? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Your support helps us bring stories like this into the light." The villa was still stained with the memory of what happened when police led Eric Dalton away in handcuffs. The children's cries had not yet faded. Jade remained on the floor trembling, begging officers not to place her father in the same vehicle as Trevor's body. But the law moved like machinery, cold, procedural, unbothered by heartbreak. And the man who had spent 8 years searching for his daughter was walked into a patrol car without resistance, as if the fight had finally drained out of him. What followed was a legal storm that no one in the Dalton family was ready for. Eric's arrest made headlines across the Bahamas and the US, labeled everything from a crime of passion to a father's revenge. Prosecutors initially considered a murder charge, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated the case became. 8 years of documented trauma, hundreds of pages of therapy notes, dozens of recorded attempts to locate a missing child, and the revelation that Jade's disappearance had involved manipulation, grooming, illegal documents, and a coordinated escape plan. The courtroom became a stage where every wound was exposed. During the trial, experts testified about the psychological devastation Eric had carried since 2016, how unresolved grief fractures a person's sense of reality. One trauma specialist, voice steady yet soft, described Eric as a man living with a coffin but no body, mourning a child he believed died in his care. The phrase rippled through the courtroom like a silent shockwave. Even some jurors wiped their eyes. The defense argued that Eric's emotional disturbance was not just real, but overwhelming. They detailed the moment he discovered Jade alive, an experience so jarring that psychologists described it as psychic whiplash. They painted a picture of a father pushed past the edge, a grief-stricken man confronting the predator who had stolen nearly a decade of his life. The prosecution didn't deny his pain, but they insisted, that emotional devastation did not justify pulling a trigger. They showed photos of the crime scene. They described the fear of the children who witnessed the shooting. They played the 911 recording where Jade could be heard screaming for someone to help her father, her voice shredded by panic. By the end of closing arguments, the jury didn't see a villain. They didn't see a hero. They saw a broken man trying to claw his way through a nightmare. They returned a verdict of voluntary manslaughter, a recognition that Eric's actions were driven by overwhelming emotional disturbance rather than premeditation. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But the legal fallout didn't end there. When investigators combed through Jade's past, they uncovered the forged documents, the false identities, the financial trail, and the participation, willing or not, in a plan that had hidden her from law enforcement for nearly a decade. Prosecutors argued that Jade was no longer a child when she continued living under Trevor's control. The law saw something different from the emotional truth. She was charged with fraud, conspiracy to evade law enforcement, and contributing to her own disappearance long after she turned 18. Her sentence, 5 years. Vanessa attended every hearing. She sat through testimony that tore her apart in ways she couldn't articulate. She watched her ex-husband taken away in shackles. She watched her daughter, older but still carrying the timid stiffness of the girl she once was, apologize through tears that never seemed to stop. And she watched the 3 little children, her grandchildren, placed into the care of relatives because their mother and the man they believed was their father were gone. Her grief fractured into something unrecognizable. She wasn't just a mother mourning a lost daughter anymore. She was a woman, watching her entire family pulled apart by a chain of events that began with a breakup, a manipulative man, and a 15-year-old searching for affection in all the wrong places. Inside prison walls, Eric agreed to a series of interviews for the documentary. Those sessions became the emotional spine of the final chapter. He sat across from the camera with a softness that didn't match the weight of his story. The lines around his eyes had deepened, his shoulders curved as though carrying years of guilt. He never justified pulling the trigger. But he never apologized for killing Trevor. "I don't regret stopping him," he said quietly. "Not for a second. He destroyed my daughter's life, he destroyed my marriage, and he made me bury a child who wasn't dead." The interviewer asked if he regretted anything at all. Eric looked down at his hands, a father's hands, a grieving man's hands, a killer's hands. "I regret that my grandchildren saw it," he whispered. "I regret they'll grow up with that memory. And I regret not being the father Jade needed before all of this. I failed her long before Trevor got to her." In her own interview, Jade appeared fragile, her voice unsteady but honest. She described the terror of those first months after the escape, then the shame of staying too long, then the guilt of raising children inside a lie. "I didn't know how to undo what I'd done," she said, "and the longer I stayed, the harder it became. I didn't know if I deserved to come home." She doesn't call Trevor a monster. She doesn't call him a partner. She calls him a man who made me believe I had no other choice. The documentary does not end with redemption, because this story doesn't offer any. Instead, the final image is quiet, haunting. 3 small children standing in a park, holding hands, staring at a world forever changed, trying to build a future from a past they never asked for. There's a moment, after the courtroom lights dim and the transcripts fade, when you realize there is no version of this story that ends cleanly. No justice neat enough to soothe a wound this deep. No sentence long enough to undo what manipulation stole from a 15-year-old girl who just wanted to feel chosen. No verdict powerful enough to rebuild a family shattered across 2 prisons and 3 tiny hearts left behind. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Some stories don't break in one moment. They fracture slowly, over years, until everyone involved is carrying a piece of the same grief. Eric Dalton sits in a cell, replaying the night he pulled a trigger and the years that led him there. Jade wakes up behind bars too, wrestling with the weight of choices she was too young to understand and too scared to undo. Vanessa stands alone, the bridge between them, holding the pieces of a life she never imagined would end this way. And somewhere, Far from the courtroom and the headlines, 3 children grow up asking questions no one knows how to answer. What does justice look like in a story like this? What does forgiveness look like? And how do you rebuild a future when the past refuses to stay buried? These aren't questions with easy answers, but they're worth asking. Because sometimes the act of asking is the first step toward understanding the lives left in the wreckage. Before you go, tell me what you think. Is there any real justice in a case like this, or is everyone a victim in their own way? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this matter to you, if you believe truth deserves to be heard, like, subscribe, share, and turn on notifications. Your support keeps these stories alive and reminds the world that every voice, even the broken ones, still deserves to be heard.